And the African Airlines Association has raised some concerns over the outsourcing of airport services and operations to private sector businesses through concessioning agreements. The industry association says that although it supports private sector participation in service delivery, it also strongly opposes any model that places financial gains above the core principles of service provision. Now, it also added that there is a need for balanced concessioning agreements that ensure fair pricing while maintaining service standards and upholding safety protocols. The association is also advocating for the inclusion of multiple service providers at airports in order to prevent monopolistic practices and also to encourage healthy competition. This comes barely a year after such a proposal between India's Adani Enterprises and the Kenyan government to manage Nairobi's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport under a 30-year concession was cancelled. Now, of course, this all comes from a report which also found that the industry is bearing the weight of heavy taxes as well. And let's find out more about that report. We're now joined by Sean Mendis. He's an aviation executive. Now, of course, that report had quite a lot in it. They talk about concerns around concessioning. They also talked about concerns around heavy taxation in the sector. So give us more insight into what the industry is calling a concerning trend of increasing taxes, increasing fees as well, increasing charges for airline. Why are we seeing governments and airport authorities raising these costs?
Thanks very much for having me. I think the first thing a lot of the people need to understand is that these taxes and fees actually come in a 1-2 punch. There are the direct taxes, which are the ones that passengers see added onto their ticket price. So, for example, say you're flying out of Ghana, you're going to pay $60 if you're flying regionally, all the way up to maybe $150 if you're flying in first class intercontinentally. In addition to that, however, airlines also have to pay fees and landing fees and navigation fees and lighting fees and all sorts of user fees to the airport authority and to the concession holders at these airports as user fees in order to get the services that they that they need in order to load planes, to fuel planes, and so forth. And increasingly, we see that there are additional royalties being added to them. So airlines, in their own way, have to either absorb those fees or pass them on to the consumers. And most airlines, being businesses, they have no choice but to pass it on to the consumer. So the reality is the consumer is being charged fees, but they're also being charged taxes. And this is something that really can add up to a significant chunk of the costs that a person is paying when they are buying a ticket for travel to, from, or within Africa.
And as you've said, these costs are not just impacting airline profitability, they're also trickling down to passengers. But how have we seen them reflect on the way the industry operates now? And of course, as you said, the overall bottom lines.
Well, I think the main thing we see, and this is something that's no secret to anybody who's in Africa, is that it is stifling growth of air transportation in Africa. Africa accounts for about 17% of the world's population, but less than 3% of the world's air traffic. Now, even accounting for the fact that African GDP is not as strong as maybe more developed countries, that is a near criminal amount of traffic that is not being able to be released. And a big reason for this is taxation. If you look in terms of the percentage of taxes that are charged to African airlines relative to the total cost of a ticket, you find that these taxes are extremely high. And again, let's look at a short route. Let's look at a West African short route, say a round trip ticket between Freetown in Sierra Leone and Monrovia in Liberia. This is a 40-minute flight, so it really should not cost too much. However, the taxes that governments themselves are charging is $298 for just the departure from Freetown, and another $140-something from Liberia. So before the airline even begins to start earning a single dollar, the first $450 that a passenger pays for a 40-minute flight is going straight into government general revenue pockets. Now, some of this will have an impact in terms of aviation infrastructure, or at least it's supposed to. But the reality is, it simply means that passengers are not going to fly, trade is not going to happen, tourism is not going to grow. And consequently, we're seeing that, it simply becomes harder to travel within Africa, and that is, to the detriment of the African taxpayer and the African traveling public.
Quite interesting. But is this a global issue or is it an African issue? How does Africa's tax burden compare with that of regions such as Europe or even the Middle East?
Well, there are pockets in Europe which have high taxes as well, and some of those taxes are intended to be punitive. For example, the United Kingdom has what they call an air passenger duty, which is basically a tax that they charge an airline for the right to export a passenger from the United Kingdom. But that is generally, to raise revenue, and it's a luxury they have because their policy is to try and decrease the amount of air transport for environmental and other reasons. Africa does not have that luxury. So Africa is actually charging higher taxes than other developing countries for the most part, and Africa is doing it without the luxury of having a solid road or rail network to fall back on. And this is what is winding up actually causing problems in terms of African trade, African GDP growth, and all the other unintended consequences when you are trying to, raise general revenue. And unfortunately, this is what happens.
Well, so what happens next? What is your view on what could happen next in terms of the government's willingness to create a sort of a more balanced approach to aviation taxation going forward? Is anything going to change?
I think the key words you're using over there is a balanced approach. Certainly, there is a need to have cost recovery. Infrastructure doesn't come for free, and African governments are not flush with cash. So certainly, users of that infrastructure are going to have to pay at least a part of that. However, the reality is, if you start taxing aviation because you say only the elite can fly, the reality is it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where now you have priced everybody except the elite out of actually being able to fly. And airlines are struggling for that, and governments consequently need to actually look at investing not in taking this tax revenue and investing it back into aviation infrastructure rather than investing it into things like national airlines and subsidies for preferred, national champions or so forth, where the entire industry and consequently the entire tax-paying base does not benefit from it. So I think governments, once they realize that when you are able to actually develop the infrastructure and let the private sector go out and develop a solution out there where government is providing a level playing field and competition and a regulatory environment where this can work, I think you'll see that a lot of African countries which have adopted that kind of approach, for example, Ghana's domestic market, a lot of other countries in the world, maybe South Africa to some extent, are seeing growth in their industry as a result of that, when government steps back, invests in infrastructure, and does not necessarily look to tilt the field one way or the other.